In this video, you'll get an overview of the complete After Effects workflow, as well as an introduction to the basic terminology used throughout After Effects. After you've watched this video, you'll have a better idea of what specific videos to watch in this video training course to satisfy your specific needs. You won't need to perform the steps in this video yourself, but if you want to follow along, you can open the Introducing project in the Assets folder. No matter what kind of work you're doing in After Effects, the basic steps are often the same. You usually import assets, such as movies and still image items. You use those assets as sources for layers, which you assemble in a composition. You modify the properties of the layers, including animating some of the properties. You add effects to layers and often modify and animate their properties. You preview your composition, and then you render and export the composition to an output movie. Let's look at each of these steps in a bit more detail. Whenever After Effects is running, a project is open. You can see which project is open by looking at the top of the application window. Here we see Introducing.aep, which is the name of the project that we have open. Introducing.aep is the file name extension for projects. You'll almost always import items into a project. We refer to these items that are imported as source files. Within a project, source files are used as the basis for footage items. Here in the project panel, we have some folders into which the footage items have been placed to keep them organized. If I click this triangle, we can see all of the footage items that I've placed in the Movies folder. I'll drag this column heading so that you can see a little bit more of the titles. These are the names of the footage items. Usually they're based on the source file name, although you can rename these yourself. You can open a footage item in its own footage panel by double-clicking it in the project panel. In the footage panel, you can preview a footage item, and you can trim it. Trimming refers to selecting only a portion of the footage item to use in the composition. The composition is the basic framework for a movie. Here is a composition in the project panel. If I double-click a composition in the project panel, it opens in both the composition panel and the timeline panel. The timeline panel and composition panel give two complementary ways of looking at a composition. In the timeline panel, you can see each individual layer in a composition, and you can interact with its properties individually. The composition panel, on the other hand, shows the visual composite of all of these layers. A composite is, roughly speaking, the visual result from stacking layers on top of one another. One of the primary things that you do in After Effects is to stack layers on top of one another and then determine how one layer shows through another. This is referred to as compositing. Here in the timeline panel, you can see that we have one layer called Logo Precomposition. And from the icon, you can see that this is itself a composition. You can have compositions nested one inside of the other, with the nested composition, or the precomposition, serving as the source for a layer in much the same way that any other footage item does. If we double-click this precomposition layer, it opens in its own composition panel. Here, we can see that this composition consists of just the logo. We can go back to view the containing layer by clicking its tab in the timeline panel. Each layer has several properties. You can view the properties of a layer by clicking the triangle next to its name in the timeline panel. The name of the property group that all layers have is Transform. If we click its triangle and give ourselves a little bit more room in the timeline panel, we can see the names of the basic transformations. One way that you can interact with properties to change their values is to change the numbers here in the timeline panel. For example, to change the position of our vector graphic logo, we can click this number and then type a new one, and then hit Enter, and notice the position of our logo changed. To undo a change, you can press Ctrl-Z or Command-Z on macOS, and it undoes the change. You can also change properties by dragging, or for many of the properties, including these transformation properties, you can interact with the layer directly in the composition panel. Notice I can change the position property by dragging the logo directly in the composition panel. I'll press Ctrl-Z to undo. If you modify a property so that it has a different value at one time than it has at another time, that's referred to as animation. Any property that has one of these little stopwatch icons next to it can be animated. The most common way to animate properties in After Effects is to use keyframes. A keyframe specifies that a property has a certain value at a certain time. And then, usually, you have a keyframe at another time that specifies a different value. After Effects will interpolate, or make up the information in between the two keyframes, so that once you've set two keyframes, After Effects will take care of all of the work in between at determining what value the property should have in between them. You enable animation for a property by clicking the stopwatch. This sets a keyframe, as indicated by this little icon. Then you can move to another time and change the property. And note, if I move the current time indicator to a position between the two keyframes, the position is interpolated between the two. You disable animation for a property by clicking the stopwatch again. Let's look at a property that already has some keyframes on it. I'll click this triangle to close the transform properties, and this triangle to close the precomposition layer. And then I'll select this layer, desaturation adjustment layer, and look at its opacity property, which has a keyframe here and a keyframe here. Notice the opacity property says 100% now. And if we move to the earlier keyframe, it says 0%, meaning that the adjustment layer goes from 0% opacity to 100% opacity over this duration. The purpose of this adjustment layer is to contain effects. And if we expand the effects group, we can see that this has a black and white effect applied to it. By animating the opacity of the adjustment layer, we have animated the influence of the black and white effect. So if we drag the current time indicator, we can see that when the adjustment layer has opacity of 0%, the black and white effect has no effect. And here, when the opacity of the adjustment layer is 100%, the black and white effect is having its full result. After Effects comes with hundreds of effects. You can see what effects are applied to a layer by selecting the layer and looking in the Effect Controls panel. You can also manipulate effects in the Timeline panel. You can browse effects either through the Effect menu or, preferably, in the Effects and Presets panel. At various points in your work, you'll need to preview your movie. One of the ways that we've already used is to drag the current time indicator. Previewing by dragging their current time indicator is often referred to as scrubbing. You can also initiate something called a RAM preview by clicking the RAM preview button. This will render all the frames of the composition, and this green bar growing here is showing the frames being cached into RAM. When all of the frames have been rendered and cached into RAM, then RAM preview will play back the composition in real time. Sometimes RAM previews can take a little while to build, depending on how computationally intensive a composition is. But once all of the frames have been cached into RAM, everything plays back at normal speed. And here our RAM preview is done, and so the movie plays back at normal speed. I'll stop the RAM preview. Once you're happy with the way that your movie looks, it's time to render and export it. Rendering is the process of creating finished frames from all of the information that you've given After Effects about the composition. And exporting is the process of encoding those frames into a movie file, or into a still image sequence, or into some other format that can be used by a movie player or other post-production software. When you're ready to render and export your movie, you add it to the render queue. You can go to File, Export, Add to Render Queue, or you can go to Composition, Add to Render Queue, or you can just use the keyboard shortcut, Control-M. I'll use the keyboard shortcut, Control-M or Command-M on Mac OS. And the Render Queue panel opens. Here in the Render Queue, we see Render Settings and Output Module Settings. The render settings tell After Effects how to create the rendered frames from the information in the composition, and the Output Module Settings tell After Effects how to use those rendered frames and convert them and encode them into output files. Once you have specified an output location, the next thing to do is click Render, and then you're ready to go. And that chime means that After Effects has finished rendering and exporting the movie. So that's a very quick tour of the After Effects workflow and interface. To recap, you start with a project. The project contains compositions and footage items. Footage items are the sources for layers. You assemble layers together in compositions. You animate the properties of layers. You can add effects to layers. Effects add their own properties to layers, and you can animate the effect properties just like any other properties. You preview your composition, then when you're done, you render and export your composition. We'll be covering each of these steps in much more detail throughout this video training course.